Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we finish working on our last project ever before moving on to GameMaker 2.3. Now, last time we focused heavily on the gameplay aspect of our project. This covered enemy interactivity, including behavior when it came to warp pads. We also finally started dipping our toes in progression with the addition of a spawn sequencer for our warp pads. The system itself was broken down into its own states and state timer with additional moments. And when packed all together, it provided us with a glimpse into the quote-unquote gameplay loop, which we will not only continue working on today, but also complete. So today we'll focus on finalizing the gameplay loop by adding an actual progression system to the game. We'll also focus on the visuals of the game by adding animations and effects to spice things up. And assuming nothing goes horribly wrong and thus derailing our entire endeavor this month, we'll do some reflecting on our final project before moving on to GameMaker 2.3. Now that's a hefty plan, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. Progress was our first stop, so a number of new variables would be required. These modifiers would be necessary in order to create said progression, which sadly meant I needed to do math. And instead of going over each and every modification, I'll instead describe the idea behind the progression. The enemy spawns will start as a trickle with new enemies popping up every X amount of time. The time between spawns will get shorter as the level progresses. As for the warp pads, the amount of pads spawned at the start are plentiful. However, over time, that number starts to decrease along with their lifespans, which should slowly increase the difficulty of eliminating enemies. Speaking of enemies, at the start, enemy types are limited to 1 or 2 types. And over time, as the difficulty rises, more types are added to the pool. The same limitation is also applied to the warp pads. And if it's not clear by now, these modifications are all determined based on the current quote-unquote level of difficulty. Now, this took a ton of time to get down, and even then, I kept tinkering with the numbers throughout the session. However, as you can see, not only did these additions not break the game, but there now exist rules and restrictions for both pads and enemies. And for testing purposes, the game level would be increased anytime an enemy was knocked into a pad. That will be changed later. But for now, we had a solid grasp on the gameplay, so it was time to pretty things up a bit. In an attempt to not animate too much, I wanted to try simply squishing the player's sprites as they walked. Using a very basic set of conditionals, I attempted to do just that. However, no matter how I set it up, the squish effect just didn't look right with such a low resolution, so actual animation would be required. And using just GameMaker Sprite Editor, I got to work. This took some time, as the most difficult part was getting the visual of movement down with so few pixels, without over-exaggerating the visuals. Eventually, our little Yeti friend was bobbing, probably a little too much, but I still had so much left to do that I went with it. Next up was the enemy animation, which was far easier to animate because the entire sprite is just one color. Then to add a similar bob to the enemy, I had its face position changed based on the image index. And there we had it. Now everyone was bobbing and weaving like Yetis and random blobs of color do in the real world. So with animations done, we had to do something about that environment. While warp pads alone would be fine, just having them come out of the ground seemed weird. So I went with the idea of a glass floor of some type. So I guess the warp effect was more of some death towel or something. I don't know. What I do know is that it looked butt ugly. Like the absolute worst eyesore I think that has ever appeared in this series. In order to salvage the idea, I darkened the stage and tweaked the colors. And it ended up looking far better than before. I then tiled the surrounding walls a nice shade of blue, and there we had it, our level. Honestly, I wanted to go vibrant with the stage design, but something somewhere would have got lost in the visuals since we're already using so many colors as is. Anyway, with the stage done, we needed to work on even more details. I created a debris object which would spawn anytime the enemy gets knocked into a pad. I gave the debris a ton of variables to determine the speed and direction so that we'd get a nice burst effect whenever an enemy is destroyed. And well, something went wrong because testing showed enemies bursting into debris, yes, but the debris was less bursty and more, I don't know, crazed bees after their hive has been disturbed. Whatever it is, it looked better than what I was after, so I decided to keep the angry bees burst effect. In fact, I loved it so much I decided to use the same effect for the enemy spawns, only instead of colored puffs they were white puffs. And there we had it, our project was basically completed. Now, if this were an actual game, it'd be a score attack game with a one life hero. Maybe some added power-ups or something to add more variety, but the point would be to survive as long as possible while your options start to diminish over time. And if the decrease in options didn't get you, surely the number of enemies would. All in all, despite having to make a few compromises, I think the final product was still pretty solid. The concept was solid, and I think with enough time and polish, it could definitely be better. Which is honestly a great way to say goodbye to the old way of doing things, because with 2.3 on the horizon, a ton of things I did to make this project happen won't be happening ever again. But that, my friends, is for another day, because this brings us to the end of our last project in GameMaker 2.25 and this episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our little project in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in 2.3.